The evacuation notice had come through on a Tuesday, which Michael had always felt was the most bureaucratic day of the week. The kind of day specifically designed for bad news delivered in official fonts. Doral Station had been processing refugees for 11 days by the time he arrived, and in those 11 days it had surpassed its intake capacity by a figure that the station's administrative AI, DORIS, reported with the cheerful precision of something that had never once needed to sleep. Current occupancy stands at 312% of optimal parameters, DORIS announced through the corridor speakers as Michael navigated a hallway that smelled of recycled air, industrial cleaning solution, and the specific exhaustion of several dozen species packed into a space designed for far fewer. Doral Station thanks you for your patience and reminds all residents that the Level 4 Wellness Seminar on Stress Management has been rescheduled to tomorrow at 9th hour. Attendance is encouraged. Michael stopped walking long enough to look up at the nearest speaker with an expression he usually reserved for tax documentation. Then he kept moving, because standing still on Doral Station meant becoming part of the architecture. He had been a logistics coordinator for the Interplanetary Relief Cooperative for 6 years, which meant he had developed a specific skill set. The ability to locate bottlenecks in impossible systems, to remain calm when every variable was wrong simultaneously, and to eat standing up without registering that he was doing it. He was not a soldier, not a diplomat, not a man whose name appeared on any document that mattered. He was the person who made sure the documents that mattered had somewhere to go. It was unglamorous work performed by someone who had long ago made peace with being unglamorous, which, he had found, was the only way to do it well. The supply corridor on Level 2 had become something of an unofficial gathering point, too narrow to serve as proper shelter, but too wide to simply walk through without pausing. People sat against the walls in the specific posture of those who have been frightened for so long that fear has become structural, load-bearing, a thing they are now simply built around rather than feeling. Children moved differently from adults in these spaces. Adults went still. Children either collapsed entirely or continued operating at full capacity, with the unsettling resilience of creatures who had not yet learned to properly anticipate disaster. The chocolate bar had been in Michael's jacket pocket since Kepler Base, 3 transit stops and what felt like a geological epoch ago. It was a single bar of dark chocolate from a small producer in Lyon, slightly softened from body heat, still wrapped in its paper sleeve with the careful typography of something that believed in itself. He had been saving it without consciously deciding to save it, the way people sometimes preserve small things from before, not from sentimentality exactly, but from some quieter instinct that resists full articulation. He noticed the girl the way you notice a specific silence in a room full of noise. She was small, even accounting for her age, which he estimated at somewhere between 6 and 8 years old by human reckoning, though he was aware this was approximate at best. Her skin was a deep crimson that had gone slightly pale at the edges, in the particular way that exhaustion blanches color from the extremities first. Her ears were long, curving upward to soft points that moved almost imperceptibly when she was attending to something, which she was now, attending to him, with large dark eyes that held the particular quality he had noticed in children who had been in crisis long enough that they had stopped performing their emotions for adult consumption, and had arrived somewhere quieter and older on the other side of it. She was not asking for anything. This was the detail that caught him most completely. She was simply standing near him with the composed presence of someone who has learned through careful empirical study that asking does not reliably produce results, and has adjusted their methodology accordingly. Michael looked at her for a moment. He looked at the chocolate bar. He performed a brief internal calculation that was not actually very complicated and reached its conclusion quickly, as honest calculations tend to do. He opened the wrapper, broke the bar with the deliberate attention it deserved, and held out the larger half. She looked at it. She looked at him. She took it with both hands, the way you accept something you intend to take seriously, and ate it with a focused, unhurried concentration that he found unexpectedly moving, as though the chocolate were a document requiring careful analysis, and she was determined to do it justice. When she finished, she looked up at him and said, in clear and careful succession, "Thank you in Standard, thank you in Vethani, and thank you in what he was fairly certain was Old Rithkai, a language spoken fluently by approximately 900 people in the known systems, none of whom were typically 7 years old." Michael blinked. "You're welcome," he said, in Standard only because he had limits. She nodded once with the gravity of someone closing a formal proceeding, and then looked up at him again with an expression that was almost conversational. "My name is Asha," she said. "Michael," he said. "My mother," Asha said with the calm tone of someone relaying a scheduling update, "is currently stopping a war." Michael looked at her. The corridor hummed around them. DORIS announced, distantly, that the Level 3 hydration stations had been temporarily suspended due to maintenance, but that Doral Station remained committed to optimal wellness outcomes. "That's," Michael said, "a lot for a Tuesday." Asha sat down beside him with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who has assessed the available options and selected the most reasonable one. The corridor wall was not comfortable. She did not appear to require it to be. She folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead at the opposite wall with an expression of patient attentiveness, as though she were waiting for it to say something interesting. Michael, who had been planning to move on to the Level 3 intake logs approximately 20 minutes ago, found that he had not moved. He leaned against the wall beside her and decided that the Level 3 intake logs were probably fine. They were almost certainly not fine. He stayed anyway. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 4 days, Asha said, "and approximately 7 hours. DORIS has been very informative about the passage of time." "DORIS is informative about everything." "Yes," Asha agreed, with the tone of someone being diplomatically restrained. "She told me this morning that my stress indicators suggested I might benefit from creative expression, and offered to print me a coloring sheet of Doral Station's structural schematics." She paused. "I completed it. The ventilation system is more complex than it appears from the residential levels." Michael looked at her. She was not joking. He decided this was one of the more remarkable things he had encountered in 6 years of fieldwork. And his fieldwork had once included negotiating supply access during a solar event on a station where 3 of the 4 administrators had been convinced, incorrectly but passionately, that they were the only rational person present. "Where were you before the station?" he asked. "Vethsara," she said. The name landed with a small weight. Vethsara was one of the outer colony settlements that had been in the direct path of the Kale incursion, a conflict that the official communications still referred to as a territorial dispute, which was the diplomatic equivalent of calling a collapsed building a structural adjustment. "We left when my mother determined that remaining had become tactically inadvisable." "She sounds careful." Asha considered this with genuine thoughtfulness. "She is precise," she said finally. "Careful implies hesitation. She does not hesitate. She calculates very quickly and then acts completely." She tilted her head slightly, her long ears shifting with the movement. "She once made a decision in 4 seconds that redirected an entire fleet engagement. My father says that 4 seconds is actually quite long for her." Michael absorbed this. "Your father, is he here too?" "He is on Vethsara still," Asha said, and her voice did not change in any detectable way, which was its own kind of change. "He stayed to help coordinate the civilian networks. He is very good at that." She paused. "He is also very stubborn. My mother says these 2 qualities are not unrelated." The corridor moved around them in its continuous low current of people and noise, and the particular ambient frequency of a place operating past its own limits. A Vethani family moved past. Adults with the same long ears as Asha, crimson-skinned, carrying the careful arrangements of people who have reduced their lives to what can be carried. Two children slightly older than Asha walked with their eyes down in the posture of those conserving everything, including attention. One of them glanced at Asha as they passed, and something moved between them. Not a smile exactly, more the minimal acknowledgement of shared coordinates. Michael watched them go. "Do you know them?" "From the transit shelter on level 1, Asha said. "The older one, Riva, taught me a card game from the Vithani southern settlements. It has 32 rules and most of them contradict each other." She paused. "I won twice." "Out of how many games?" 14. Another pause in which she appeared to be doing the mathematics honestly. "Riva is very good." Doris chose this moment to announce that the eastern gate on level 2 was experiencing what she described as elevated population density, requiring voluntary dispersal, and that all residents were encouraged to relocate to secondary corridors at their earliest convenience, and that Doral Station thanked everyone for their cooperative spirit. The announcement had the calm inevitability of a weather system that had been visible on the horizon for some time, and had now arrived. Michael stood and looked down the corridor toward the eastern gate, where the quality of the crowd noise had shifted in the specific way it shifts when density crosses from uncomfortable into something with edges. He had learned to hear that shift the way sailors learn to read water. "I need to go check that," he said. Asha stood up beside him with no particular urgency, as though she had already calculated that this was the next development and had simply been waiting for him to catch up. "I will come," she said. It was not a request framed as a statement. It was simply a statement. Michael looked at her. He thought about the 17 protocols regarding unaccompanied minors in crisis facilities. He thought about the fact that she had been navigating this station for 4 days alone with apparent competence that exceeded several of his colleagues. He thought about the look on her face, which was composed and watchful and not frightened, or rather, not newly frightened, which in this context was the operative distinction. "Stay close," he said. "Obviously," said Asha. The Eastern Gate was, in the technical language of crisis management, a situation. In the more immediate language of people who were currently in it, it was considerably worse than that. The gate itself was a large pressurized entry point, originally designed to process cargo manifests and the occasional dignitary, neither of which required the gate to have feelings about its work. It had not been designed for the volume of people currently pressing against it from both sides, those inside wanting information, those outside wanting entry, and the gate itself apparently experiencing what Doris had diplomatically classified as elevated population density, which was the kind of phrase that did a great deal of work trying to sound like it wasn't describing something genuinely dangerous. Michael moved through the crowd with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned that apologizing, while moving, is faster than stopping to apologize properly. Asha moved behind him with an ease that suggested she had either done this before or possessed some natural aptitude for crowd navigation that her people had developed over generations of presumably very busy public spaces. She did not grab his jacket. She simply remained exactly 2 steps behind him with a consistency that he found, in a peripheral way, impressive. The source of the compression became apparent as they got closer. A secondary airlock on the gate's eastern face had malfunctioned and locked in a half-open position. Not enough to let people through, enough to convince people that it was about to. This had created a congregation of optimists directly in front of it, which had then created a secondary congregation of people trying to see what the first congregation was looking at, which had then created the kind of recursive crowd problem that station engineers wrote anxious papers about. 2 relief workers were attempting to manage the flow with the heroic futility of people trying to redirect a river with their hands. Michael recognized one of them, a tall Callian named Drev, whose four-armed species gave him a statistical advantage in crowd management that he was currently deploying at full capacity and finding insufficient. "Drev," Michael said, arriving beside him. Drev turned 3 of his 4 eyes toward Michael while keeping the 4th on the crowd, an ability Michael had envied for years. The locking mechanism on the secondary airlock has decided, Drev said, with the measured calm of someone who has accepted the universe's fundamental hostility toward engineering, that it is on holiday. Can we get a technical team down here? I submitted the request 40 minutes ago. DORIS confirmed it and then recommended I consider a breathing exercise. Drev paused. I have 4 respiratory systems. The recommendation was not helpful. Michael looked at the airlock. It was a Model 7 Harkin pressurized seal, a design he knew well enough from 6 years of field logistics, which was a design known well enough in field logistics for being mechanically reliable and almost cosmically stubborn when it decided to fail. The manual override panel was visible on the left side of the frame, half obscured by the crowd but accessible if you were willing to be uncomfortable about it. He looked at Asha. Stay here with Drev. Asha looked at Drev with the evaluating expression of someone conducting a rapid but thorough assessment. Drev looked back at her with 2 of his eyes. Hello, he said. Hello, said Asha. You have 4 arms. I am aware, said Drev. That seems useful. It has its moments, Drev said, and something in his expression shifted toward what Michael had learned to recognize as a Callian smile, which manifested mostly around the secondary eye ridge and required knowing what you were looking for. Michael moved toward the airlock panel with his head down and his elbows doing the diplomatic work. The crowd was not hostile. It was simply dense with the compressed anxiety of people who had been uncertain for too long and had located something specific to be uncertain about. He reached the panel, popped the manual cover, and looked at the override configuration with the focused attention of someone who really hoped his memory of Model 7 schematics was accurate and not, for instance, the memory of a completely different model that he had conflated over time through the gradual erosion of technical specificity that field work produced. It was, in fact, a Model 7. He released a breath he hadn't scheduled and began working the override sequence. Behind him, he could hear Asha's voice, clear and carrying, with the particular projection of someone accustomed to being heard in difficult acoustic environments. She was talking to the people nearest her, he realized. Not loudly, not with any official authority, but with a calm and direct informational quality that was doing something to the immediate crowd density around her position. People were listening. Children especially were watching her with the focused attention that children give to other children who appear to know something. The airlock gave a sound like a large mechanism reconsidering its life choices, and then the secondary seal disengaged with a pressurized sigh and locked properly into its open position. The crowd shifted and began, slowly, to find its own equilibrium the way crowds do when the specific point of friction is removed. Michael stepped back from the panel. Drev appeared beside him with the quiet arrival of someone who moves well for their size. Good, Drev said simply. Asha helped, Michael said, watching her. Drev watched her too. She is very young to speak to crowds like that, he said. She thanks people in 3 languages and reads structural schematics for recreation, Michael said. I'm adjusting my expectations accordingly. Asha, apparently satisfied that the immediate situation had resolved, turned and located Michael across the thinning crowd with no visible difficulty, and walked toward him with the unhurried composure of someone returning from a task that had gone as anticipated. The airlock is fixed, she observed. It is, he said. She nodded, processing this as confirmed data. Then she looked up at him with a slight shift in her expression, not quite concern, something adjacent to it, something more considered. My mother, she said, should have been here by now. Michael looked at her. The corridor hummed. DORIS announced that the eastern gate had returned to nominal operating parameters and wished everyone a restorative afternoon. How long has she been stopping the war? Michael asked. Asha's long ears tilted slightly. Long enough, she said, and for the first time since he had met her, she sounded precisely her age. They found a space near the level 2 observation alcove. A small indentation in the corridor wall originally designed to house a now-removed information terminal, which meant it was approximately the right size for one adult and one child to occupy without being moved along by the general flow of the station. Michael had learned early in his fieldwork that in overcrowded facilities, the most valuable real estate was not square footage but stillness. A place where you could stop without becoming an obstacle, where you could exist without negotiating for the right to do so. Asha sat on the alcove's low equipment shelf with her hands folded and her eyes on the middle distance in the particular way she had, which Michael was beginning to understand, was not vacancy, but a kind of active interior processing. The look of someone running calculations that weren't ready to be spoken yet. He leaned against the alcove frame and watched the corridor move. A medical team in blue transit suits pushed a supply float past them, the anti-grav mechanism humming at a frequency slightly below comfortable. A group of Vethani elders moved with the careful dignity of people who have decided that no circumstance will cause them to abandon their posture. Somewhere further down the corridor, a child was crying with the specific sustained energy of someone who had been at it for a while and had no intention of stopping. And somewhere closer, a different child was laughing at something. And the two sounds wove together into the complicated texture of a place that was, against considerable odds, still functioning. "Tell me about Veth Sara," Michael said. Asha looked at him with a brief evaluating pause, the kind that precedes a decision about how much to say. "It is a good planet," she said. "The light is different there. It comes through the atmosphere at an angle that makes everything look like early morning even when it is midday." She was quiet for a moment. "I used to find it annoying. I wanted it to look like afternoon sometimes." Michael said nothing. He had learned that silence, deployed correctly, was an invitation. "The Kale incursion began in the outer agricultural zones," she continued, with the careful factual tone of someone who has processed something difficult by converting it into information. "My mother was already in the defense network. She had been monitoring the border tensions for 11 months before anyone in the central command structure was willing to classify them as what they were." Asha's ears moved slightly. "She is frequently correct before other people are ready for her to be correct. My father says this is her most exhausting quality and also her most important one." "What does your mother say about that?" "She says my father is not wrong, and that being right too early is functionally indistinguishable from being wrong, and that the solution is to be right and also very loud." Asha considered. "She is very loud when the situation requires it. When it does not require it, she is very quiet. There is not much in between." Michael found himself constructing a picture of a person from these small rendered details. Not an image exactly, more a set of coordinates. Someone precise and loud in the right registers. Someone who calculated in 4 seconds what others took hours to approach. Someone whose daughter spoke 3 languages and completed structural schematics with the self-possession of a small, very serious academic. DORIS announced that dinner service on Level 3 would be delayed by 40 minutes due to supply float recalibration, and that Doral Station appreciated everyone's gracious understanding, a quality she appeared to attribute to the station's population, with an optimism that the evidence did not fully support. "She appreciated the chocolate," Asha said abruptly. Michael looked at her. "You told her about it." "I tell her everything," Asha said, with the simple certainty of someone for whom this is not a policy but a fact of nature. "I send her a message every evening at the same time. She responds when she can, which is not always, but she always reads them." She looked down at her hands. "I told her that a human logistics coordinator had given me half of his last chocolate bar without being asked and without wanting anything in return, and that his name was Michael, and that he seemed tired but not unkind." Michael was quiet for a moment. "That's a very complete report." "She likes complete reports." A distant vibration moved through the station's hull. Not an impact. Something larger and further away. the kind of structural resonance that deep-range ships produced when decelerating through a station's gravitational envelope at speed. Michael registered it with the part of his attention that was always, in these environments, listening for things that weren't words. It was a large ship. It was moving fast and it was slowing down, which meant it had arrived at its destination, and its destination was here. Asha had gone completely still, not the stillness of her interior processing. A different quality entirely, the absolute focused stillness of someone receiving information through a channel that was not sound. "Asha," Michael said. "She is here," Asha said. Her voice had not changed. Her expression had not changed. And yet something had shifted in her with the completeness of a weather system passing. Something that had been held very carefully for a very long time, releasing its tension all at once, quietly, without drama, the way the most profound reliefs always arrive. Michael straightened. Down the corridor, the crowd noise was changing in the way it changes when something with authority enters a space, not louder but differently organized, acquiring a directionality, a current. People were moving, or rather, people were being moved, not by force but by the simple spatial logic of something that required more room than it was asking for. He could not see her yet, but he could see the crowd parting, and he could see the direction it was parting from, and he could see Asha slide off the equipment shelf and stand very straight with her hands at her sides and her ears fully forward, and her eyes fixed on a point down the corridor, with an expression that had no diplomatic category and needed none. It was the expression of a child who has been very brave for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. She came through the crowd the way a gravitational body moves through space, not by force exactly, but by the simple rearrangement of everything around her according to new priorities. The battle armor she wore was Vethani military issue, functional and unpretty in the way that things designed entirely for purpose tend to be unpretty, and it had seen recent use in ways that its surface recorded honestly. She was tall. She moved with the contained precision of someone for whom stillness and motion were equally deliberate, equally controlled, equally the product of a mind that did not do things by accident. Her ears were long, like Asha's, but held differently, forward and slightly angled in the alert configuration, taking in the full acoustic landscape of the corridor with the automatic attention of someone who had spent years in environments where the difference between a sound and the right sound was a tactical variable. She reached Asha in a straight line through the crowd. The reunion was not what Michael might have written if he had been writing it. There was no running. There was no noise. Vea came to Asha and went down to one knee in a single fluid motion, and put both hands on her daughter's face with a gentleness that was completely at odds with everything else about her. And Asha put her forehead against her mother's forehead and closed her eyes. And for a moment, the corridor with all its noise and movement organized itself respectfully around this one still point, as though it understood that something was happening here that had the right of way. Then Asha said something in Vethani, low and rapid, and Vea responded in the same register, and whatever passed between them in those few seconds was private in the way that only the most necessary things are private, not hidden, simply not for anyone else. Vea stood. She was looking at Michael before she had fully straightened, which told him something about her processing speed that confirmed everything Asha had said. He had been looked at by commanding officers before. He had been looked at by diplomats, by relief administrators, by people whose professional function required them to assess other people quickly and accurately. This was different in a way he took a moment to locate. She was not assessing his rank or his utility or his intentions. She was confirming a description. She was matching him against a report she had already received and finding the correspondence accurate, and something in her expression shifted slightly in response to that confirmation, not warmly exactly, but with a quality of attention that felt, in its own register, like a form of regard. "Michael," she said. His name and her voice had a different weight distribution than he was used to. the emphasis falling in a place that made it sound considered rather than casual. "Commander," he said, because Asha had not given him a name and it was the most accurate available title. "Vea," she said, with the slight correction of someone who extends their name as a deliberate choice rather than a social reflex. She looked at him for another moment with that same quality of direct, undecorated attention. "My daughter tells me you are a logistics coordinator." "That's right. She also tells me you gave her the larger half." Michael registered that Asha had included this level of detail in her evening report and found that he was not surprised. "It seemed like the correct division," he said. Something moved at the corner of Vea's expression. Not a smile in the full sense, but the structural precondition of one. A slight shift in the architecture of her face that suggested the mechanism existed and was capable of operation. "Among my people," she said, "giving the larger portion to another is a specific gesture. It has a formal name." "What does it mean?" "Approximately," she said. "It means that you have assessed the other person's need as greater than your own and acted on that assessment without requiring acknowledgement." She paused. "It is considered a gesture of significant respect. It is not performed casually." Michael looked at Asha, who was standing beside her mother with her arms folded, and the expression of someone who has arranged events to a satisfying conclusion and is now observing the results. Asha met his eyes and said nothing, which communicated quite a lot. "I didn't know that," Michael said. "I know," said Vea. "That makes it more accurate, not less." DORIS chose this moment to announce that Level 2 corridor ambient temperature had been adjusted for optimal comfort, and that Doral Station hoped everyone was experiencing a pleasant afternoon, a statement that landed in the current moment, with the spectacular contextual unawareness that DORIS had elevated to a consistent art form. Vea looked at the nearest speaker with an expression that suggested she was accustomed to dealing with automated systems that had strong opinions about wellness and had not yet made her peace with it. "What is that?" she asked. "That's DORIS, Michael said. "She manages station operations and believes very strongly in stress management seminars." "Has she been helpful?" "She once recommended a breathing exercise to a four-armed Callian during a crowd emergency." Vea was quiet for a moment. "I have dealt with worse tactical advisors," she said finally, which was either a very dry joke or a deeply concerning statement about Vethani military command structure, and Michael decided it was probably both. Asha tugged once, briefly, on the edge of her mother's armor, the gesture so small and automatic that it seemed like something she had done 10,000 times, a punctuation mark in a language between them. Vea looked down at her, and the quality of her face changed completely in the way that only one specific relationship in the known universe produces. She placed one hand briefly on top of Asha's head, between her ears, and Asha leaned into it for exactly 1 second before straightening again, with the dignity of someone maintaining appearances. "She has eaten?" Vea asked, looking at Michael. "Half a chocolate bar 4 hours ago," Michael said. "The station's food service has been irregular." "I am aware of what station food service is like in evacuation conditions," Vea said, and something in her voice carried the weight of someone who has eaten many bad meals in difficult places and has feelings about it that she manages through professionalism. She looked around the corridor with the systematic attention of someone conducting an assessment, and Michael watched her process the station's condition in approximately 4 seconds, which tracked with Asha's description. "You should eat also," Asha said to Michael. He looked at her. "I'm fine." Asha looked at her mother. Vea looked at Michael with an expression that indicated she had already arrived at a position on this matter, and that the position was not negotiable. "You will eat with us," she said. It was grammatically a statement. It was, in the way she said it, something more complete than an invitation and considerably more direct than a request. Michael considered the Level 3 intake logs, which had now been unattended for several hours, and were almost certainly expressing their feelings about this through the medium of administrative backlog. He considered the observation that the commander of a Vethani defense fleet had just told him he would be eating dinner, in a tone that suggested the Kale incursion had met a personality type and lost. "All right," he said. Asha nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose report had produced the correct outcome. The meal was served in a small operational room that Vaya had apparently requisitioned from the station administration, with the same energy she applied to everything else, not forcefully, simply with a clarity of intention that made alternative outcomes seem structurally unlikely. It held a table, 4 chairs, and a wall-mounted food processor that DORIS had stocked with what she described as a culturally considerate selection, which turned out to mean 2 Vethani protein rations, 1 standard human field meal, and a dessert supplement that none of them could identify but that Asha ate without hesitation and pronounced acceptable. They sat. The room was quiet in the way that small rooms are quiet inside large noisy things, not silent, but insulated, the station's continuous ambient frequency reduced to something that existed at the edge of awareness rather than the center of it. Michael had eaten field meals in worse conditions and better ones, and he had eaten them alone far more often than not, which was not a complaint so much as an accurate description of what the work looked like in practice. He was aware, in a way that registered somewhere below conscious analysis, that this was different, that the specific quality of sitting across a table from people and sharing food in a room where no one needed anything from him except his presence was different. He ate his meal and said very little and felt, without quite naming it, that something in him was being returned to its proper calibration. Vaya ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to regard food primarily as fuel and had made a separate peace with this. She asked Michael questions about the station's logistics, supply chain bottlenecks, intake processing delays, the airlock situation on the eastern gate, which she had noted on arrival with the automatic tactical inventory of someone who catalogues structural vulnerabilities as a professional reflex. Her questions were precise and specific, and assumed a level of operational knowledge that he found himself rising to meet, because being asked intelligent questions by someone who would recognize an intelligent answer was its own kind of fuel. He told her about the Model 7 Harkin seal. He told her about Drev and his 4 arms and the crowd, and Asha's voice moving through the immediate density like something with professional training. Vaya listened to the part about Asha without expression, which Michael now understood was not absence of feeling but its containment, the habit of someone who processes things completely and privately, and then acts, rather than processing publicly in real time. She has always done that, Vaya said, spoken to rooms. When she was 4, she explained to an entire transit queue why their frustration was understandable but counterproductive. A pause. They listened. "I believe that entirely," Michael said. Asha, who had been following this exchange with the alert interest of someone attending their own biographical review, said, "The transit queue was very long and people were making poor decisions," which was not a defense exactly, but was a very accurate description of what she had apparently assessed at age 4 and decided to address. After the meal, Vaya was called briefly to a communication terminal by a member of her crew, a compact Vethani officer who appeared at the door with the particular expression of someone delivering news that is not catastrophic, but is not nothing, which Michael had learned to read in field work as the specific register of a situation that needed attention without requiring alarm. Vaya excused herself with a look at Asha that communicated a complete set of instructions without words, and Asha received them with a nod that confirmed receipt and compliance. And Michael watched this wordless operational exchange with the appreciation of someone who had spent years trying to achieve exactly this quality of communication in professional contexts, and had managed it perhaps twice. He and Asha sat across the table from each other in the quiet room. "She likes you," Asha said. Michael looked at her. "We've spoken for 40 minutes. She decided in 4 seconds," Asha said. with the patience of someone explaining a system to a person unfamiliar with its parameters. The 40 minutes was for your benefit. Michael considered this. He found it difficult to refute on the available evidence. Outside the small room, Doral Station continued its enormous, improbable work. The processing of displacement, the logistics of mercy, the daily administrative miracle of keeping thousands of frightened people fed and sheltered, and moving towards something that might eventually be home. He had been part of that work for 6 years, and he would continue to be part of it. And this had always been enough because it was necessary, and he was good at it. And those two things together had always constituted sufficient reason. Something had shifted, though. Not dramatically. Not in the way that stories sometimes required shifts to announce themselves. More in the way that a navigational instrument recalibrates. A small internal adjustment whose significance would only become apparent over distance, over time, when you looked back at the heading you had taken and traced it forward to where you had arrived. He had given half a chocolate bar to a child who wasn't asking. He had stayed when he should have moved on to the level 3 intake logs. He had fixed an airlock and eaten a meal in a quiet room and been looked at by a woman who assessed things in 4 seconds and had apparently found the assessment satisfactory. None of these were large events. All of them were, in the accounting that actually mattered, enormous. Vea returned and told him that the situation which had required her attention was resolved, and he did not ask what the situation had been because the way she said resolved communicated clearly that it had been resolved in the comprehensive Vethani military sense of the word, which had a specific and final quality to it. She sat back down and looked at him across the table and said, "The cooperative's logistics network on the outer stations has significant structural vulnerabilities. I have submitted a report to Central Command. They will not read it for 6 weeks. 8, Michael said, in my experience." Something in her expression moved. "I would like someone who reads reports immediately to review it." Michael looked at her. She looked back at him with the direct, undecorated attention that he had by now understood was simply how she existed in the world, without social padding, without the performed casualness that most people used to make directness less visible. It was, he had decided, one of the more efficient ways to be a person, even if it required some adjustment on the receiving end. "I can do that," he said. Asha said nothing. She had the expression of someone who had written a complete report and received the anticipated outcome and was now simply observing the confirmation. Her long ears were relaxed, fully at rest for the first time since he had met her, and this small physical fact landed in him with a warmth that he didn't try to categorize. When they left the small room, the station received them back into its continuous noise and motion, and Vea walked beside him for the length of the corridor, toward the main transit hub, where her crew was staging for departure with the unhurried composure of someone who has resolved what needed resolving and is now simply moving through the next thing. At the transit hub entrance, she stopped and turned to him and performed a gesture, her right hand placed briefly over her sternum, fingers extended, a slight inclination of her head that was composed and deliberate and carried a weight his translation implant processed as acknowledgement, but which he understood, watching it, was considerably more specific than that. He would look it up later. He would spend longer than he expected looking it up, following the linguistic and cultural threads through Vethani formal gesture taxonomy into a territory that was more intricate and more considered than he had anticipated. And he would sit with what he found for a long time in a way that was not uncomfortable. "Thank you," Vea said, in standard, directly, with no diplomatic softening and no additional words, which he had learned in the past several hours was how she delivered the things that mattered most. Asha looked up at him from beside her mother and said, with great seriousness, "You should get more chocolate." "I'll add it to the supply requisition," he said. "Add 2, she said. "1 is not enough for emergencies." He watched them move through the transit hub and into the boarding corridor beyond, Vea's hand resting briefly on Asha's shoulder, Asha's ears forward and attentive, and no longer carrying the particular angle of a child enduring something alone. The crowd closed around them with the ordinary indifference of crowds, and they were gone, and Doral's station continued its vast and unglamorous work around him, exactly as it had before, and entirely differently. Michael stood for a moment in the transit hub's noise and motion. Then he took out his comm unit and opened the supply requisition for Level 2. He scrolled to the supplemental provisions category. He typed chocolate, and then he changed the quantity from 1 to 2, and he stood there for a moment looking at it with an expression that had no official category in any logistics database he had ever worked with. Then he submitted it and went to find the Level 3 intake logs, which had by now developed genuine grievances, and which he addressed with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, moving through the work that needed doing. In a station that held thousands of people trying to find their way forward, feeling, for reasons he could not have fully articulated and did not need to, that the heading had changed slightly, and that wherever it led, it would be worth the distance.